It was a warm, sunny afternoon, the kind of day where children could play outside for hours without feeling the cold creeping in. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the sounds of birds chirping in the trees. In a quiet neighborhood lined with modest houses and well-kept lawns, a young black boy was enjoying his afternoon like any other. He was riding his bicycle up and down the street, giggling as he passed by familiar houses. The boy was around 10 years old, full of energy and laughter, oblivious to the world's problems, his focus entirely on the simple joy of the moment. He waved at neighbors he knew, smiled at passing cars, and sometimes rang the bell at the corner store just for fun. To him, this was home. To him, the street was a safe playground where friendships were built and small adventures unfolded. His mother had taught him to be kind, polite, and confident, and he carried those lessons in every wave and greeting. But across the street, behind the curtains of one of the houses, a woman watched him with an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite shake. She was in her late 30s, tidy and neat, the kind of person who liked everything in order. As she sipped her coffee and looked out of the window, her eyes followed the boy's every move. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, nothing at all. But for reasons she could not fully explain, she felt nervous. She had seen children before, children of all ages, and she knew that most of them were harmless, but something about this boy made her anxious. Her unease grew with every passing minute, even as the boy rode his bike around the street in the most innocent and playful way. She could see him laughing, kicking up small clouds of dust from the dry patches on the pavement, and talking to the neighbor's dog as if it could answer back. And yet her uneasiness persisted, nagging at the edges of her mind like an itch she could not reach. Without thinking too deeply about it, she reached for her phone. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear for herself, but with a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. She dialed the local police station and began speaking, her voice firm, her words precise. She told the dispatcher that there was a young black boy loitering outside, acting suspiciously, and that she felt uneasy about the situation. She did not consider that the boy had lived in this neighborhood his entire life, that he knew every crack in the sidewalk, every neighbor, and every familiar sound. All she could see was what she perceived as a threat, and that perception was enough for her to call for help. Meanwhile, the boy continued his play, completely unaware of what was happening just a few yards away. He rang the doorbell of the house across the street, waved at the mailman, and giggled as he pretended his bicycle was a rocket ship. His mother, inside their home, was finishing up some chores, her mind occupied with mundane tasks, blissfully unaware that her son's ordinary playtime was about to be interrupted. The neighborhood was calm, peaceful, and typical of suburban life. Neighbors were tending to their gardens, mowing lawns, or chatting quietly across fences. Birds flitted from tree to tree, and the faint hum of traffic in the distance created a soothing background rhythm. Children's laughter was not uncommon, but for this woman across the street, it now felt like a warning bell she could not ignore. Minutes passed, and the dispatcher had already relayed her call to the local police officers on patrol. A squad car pulled slowly into the street, its lights flashing faintly, not yet turned on in full emergency mode. The officers were cautious, alert, and professional, trained to respond to reports like this carefully but unaware of the full context. They approached the boy, who was now pretending his bike was a horse, trotting along the sidewalk with a determined expression. The boy looked up as the officers stopped in front of him, his small hands gripping the handlebars and a puzzled expression spreading across his face. He had never seen anything like this happen to him before. The officers asked him questions he didn't understand at first, their voices calm but serious. He hesitated, unsure what he was supposed to do, feeling a sudden tension he had never experienced while playing outside. Inside the house, the mother heard the sirens and the voices. She rushed to the window, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the police approaching her son. Panic rose in her chest, but she quickly pushed it down, reminding herself to stay calm. She grabbed her keys and phone, rushing outside with a sense of urgency she had never felt before. Her son looked up at her with wide eyes, confused and slightly frightened, clinging to his bike as if it were a shield against the unexpected attention. By the time she reached her son, the officers were still questioning him gently, trying to assess the situation. She knelt down to his level, wrapping her arms around him briefly, whispering reassurances. The boy felt the warmth of her presence, and some of the fear began to melt away. His mother explained quickly to the officers that he was her son, that he was only playing, and that he belonged in this neighborhood. The woman who had called the police was still standing behind her curtains, watching every movement. She could see the boy and his mother, and she felt a strange mix of triumph and uncertainty. She had called for help, and now there it was, standing right in front of the child she had deemed suspicious. But even as she watched, a small part of her mind wondered if she had acted too quickly, if she had let fear cloud her judgment. Neighbors had started to notice the small commotion. Some stepped out onto their porches, curious about what was happening. Whispers spread down the street as people tried to make sense of the situation. The boy clung to his mother, still frightened but feeling safer with her there. The officers were professional, but they were also aware that the situation could escalate if handled incorrectly. The mother spoke calmly to the officers, explaining her son's routine, how he often played outside, and how he knew everyone in the neighborhood. She stressed that he had done nothing wrong and that this was just an ordinary day in the life of a child. The officers nodded, taking in the information, balancing the report they had received with the reality they now observed. Across the street, the woman remained silent, realizing that the situation was more complicated than she had imagined. Her assumptions had led to the involvement of law enforcement, and now she was forced to confront the fact that her perception might have been misguided. The boy continued to hold on to his mother, feeling the tension in the air and trying to make sense of the sudden attention. As the initial tension began to ease slightly, the mother kept her focus on her son, kneeling beside him, keeping him calm, and speaking to the officers with authority and composure. She ensured that her son knew he was safe and that this moment, while frightening, would not define him. The boy looked up at her, trusting her completely, and felt the comfort only a parent can provide. The sun continued to shine, casting long shadows across the street, while the neighborhood slowly returned to a state of cautious observation. The officers continued to ask questions. The mother continued to provide answers, and the boy began to relax, riding his bike slowly in small circles, his laughter returning in quiet bursts. The woman across the street remained behind her curtain, realizing that her actions had caused an unnecessary stir, and that the boy's innocence had been disrupted by assumptions she could no longer ignore. In that moment, the neighborhood witnessed the fragility of perception and the innocence of childhood colliding. The boy, unaware of the larger implications, simply wanted to play. His mother, aware of both the immediate and long-term impact, managed the situation with calm, strength, and wisdom beyond the tense moment. The officers, trained to respond to reports with caution, learned firsthand that appearances can be deceiving. It was just an ordinary afternoon turned extraordinary by assumptions, fear, and the sudden presence of authority. The boy's laughter, once interrupted, began to fill the air again, and his mother's steady guidance ensured that he felt protected, safe, and understood. Across the street, the woman began to reflect, her certainty shaken, as she realized that life is often more complex than it seems, and that a child's play should never be mistaken for a threat. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter, one where understanding, authority, and humanity would collide in a way that would leave everyone involved both shocked and enlightened. The boy's day, which began with simple joy, had turned into a lesson about perception, fear, and the importance of keeping innocence protected. The quiet street, still bathed in sunlight, waited for what would come next, as a community began to face the realities of bias and the power of a parent's presence. The boy's mother stood by him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders, trying to calm him as he looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She had never seen him so scared in his life, and it made her heart ache. His laughter had disappeared, replaced by confusion and anxiety. She glanced at the officers who had approached him, seeing their cautious but professional stance. They were trying to understand the situation, but the tension in the air made it clear that this was delicate. The mother knew that she had to act quickly, calmly, and with authority to protect her child and to clarify what was happening. She began speaking to the officers in a calm, measured tone, explaining that the boy was her son and that he had been playing outside as he often did. Her words were firm yet kind, and she made sure to maintain eye contact with her son to reassure him that he was safe. The boy's small hands gripped his mother's, and he tried to nod, showing that he understood her words even though he was still trembling slightly. The officers listened attentively, jotting down notes and asking gentle questions, making sure they understood the full context before taking any action. The woman who had called the police stayed behind her curtain, peering out cautiously. She watched the interaction unfold, her heart beating faster as she realized the boy's mother had arrived. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had acted out of fear and instinct, but now she was forced to confront the reality that her assumptions might have been wrong. The mother's calm presence and firm explanations were slowly changing the narrative, but the woman still hesitated, unsure of how to respond or what to say. The boy's mother gently asked him to tell the officers his name and where he lived, and he spoke quietly, his voice small but steady under his mother's guidance. She made sure he felt safe enough to answer, holding his hands and nodding encouragingly as he spoke. The officers seemed to understand more clearly now, their body language relaxing slightly as they realized that the boy was indeed just a child at play and that there was no real threat. The tension in the air began to ease, but it was still palpable, lingering like a shadow over the quiet street. Neighbors had begun to notice the scene unfolding outside. A few stepped out onto their porches, curious and concerned. They whispered, among themselves unsure of what had happened, but their presence added another layer of attention to the situation. The boy's mother acknowledged them briefly, giving a reassuring smile that showed she was handling the matter. She wanted her son to feel supported not just by her, but by the larger community, even if only subtly. The boy looked around nervously, seeing the onlookers, and instinctively clung a little closer to his mother. The officers asked the mother to explain the boy's daily routines, where he usually played, and who he interacted with in the neighborhood. She calmly outlined everything, emphasizing that he had always been safe, friendly, and well known to those who lived nearby. She spoke with confidence, showing that she was fully aware of her child's habits and that she was a responsible parent. The officers nodded, taking in the information and beginning to see that the initial report had been based on misunderstanding rather than reality. As the conversation continued, the boy began to relax slightly, encouraged by his mother's composed demeanor. He took a few cautious steps on his bike, feeling the familiar weight of it beneath him. His mother watched closely, ready to step in if he became scared again, but her calmness and reassurance seemed to have a soothing effect. The officers exchanged a glance, recognizing that the tension was easing and that their presence might no longer be strictly necessary if the situation was resolved peacefully. The woman who had called the police finally stepped outside, hesitantly, as if trying to measure the mood of the street. She kept a safe distance, unsure whether she should approach or retreat. Her heart pounded, and she realized she had underestimated the power of assumptions and the impact they could have on innocent lives. She could see the boy with his mother, looking small but protected, and she felt a mix of embarrassment and guilt. Her perception of danger had been entirely her own, and now she had to face the reality that she had involved law enforcement in a situation that did not require it. The boy's mother addressed her directly, speaking calmly but firmly. She explained that her son had been doing nothing wrong, that he was simply playing outside, and that assumptions based on fear could have serious consequences. The woman listened, speechless as the weight of the mother's words sank in. There was a moment of silence, filled only by the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of birds. The tension was still there, but it had shifted from fear to reflection. Meanwhile, the boy began to regain a sense of normalcy. He rode his bike in small circles, testing the space around him, and smiled cautiously at the officers, realizing that he was safe under his mother's guidance. His mother remained close, encouraging him with nods and quiet words, reinforcing that he had nothing to fear and that he was loved and protected. The officers continued to observe, learning firsthand about the importance of context and careful assessment in situations like these. The small crowd of neighbors continued to watch quietly, absorbing the unfolding events. Some whispered to each other about how quickly fear could lead to unnecessary action, while others nodded in silent agreement with the mother's calm approach. The boy's mother addressed the crowd briefly, reminding them that children's play should never be mistaken for misbehavior or threat. Her words carried authority, compassion, and clarity, reaching not just the woman who had called the police but everyone nearby. The officers began to step back slightly, acknowledging that the situation was under control. They spoke to the mother about safety protocols, confirming that no further action was required and that the boy was free to continue his play. The mother nodded, thanking them for their professionalism while also reinforcing the lesson about careful judgment and avoiding assumptions. The boy looked up at the officers, giving a shy wave as if to say thank you, and they returned it with a gentle nod. The woman who had called the police finally turned away, returning to her house with a new awareness of how fear and bias could influence decisions. She had witnessed firsthand how assumptions could create unnecessary tension and impact innocent lives. The boy's mother watched her leave, understanding that while this moment was difficult, it had the potential to teach a valuable lesson about understanding, empathy, and the importance of staying calm in tense situations. As the sun continued to shine over the neighborhood, the boy resumed his play, now under the careful eye of his mother. He rang the corner store bell again, laughed as he rode past neighbors, and waved at the birds in the trees. His mother stayed nearby, guiding him gently but letting him enjoy the freedom of childhood. The officers drove away slowly, leaving the neighborhood to return to its usual rhythm, and the quiet street seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The events of that afternoon left an impression on everyone involved. The boy learned, in a subtle way, that even when the world felt uncertain, he had the protection and love of his mother. The officers were reminded of the delicate balance required in responding to reports, and the neighbors witnessed the power of calm, composed, and compassionate authority. And the woman who had called the police learned a difficult but important lesson about perception, fear, and the potential harm of acting without full understanding. By the time the afternoon faded into early evening, the neighborhood had returned to its peaceful state. The boy's laughter rang out again, lighter and freer than before, echoing down the street. His mother sat on the front porch, watching him play, proud of his resilience and reassured by the calm resolution of what could have been a much more stressful encounter. The air was filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from the sense of safety, community, and understanding that had been restored, reminding everyone that moments of tension could be transformed into lessons of humanity and care. As the situation began to calm, the boy's mother continued to stand close to him, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder. She knew that although the immediate tension had lessened, the lesson of the moment was far from over. She looked at the officers and neighbors and decided it was important to speak clearly, not only for her son, but for everyone watching. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight of authority and understanding. She explained that children needed freedom to play, and that assumptions based on fear or appearances could be harmful. She emphasized that the boy had done nothing wrong and that her presence alone should have provided assurance. The officers listened intently, realizing the mother was more than just a concerned parent. She spoke with knowledge, confidence, and the kind of authority that only comes from experience and understanding. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause, as the weight of her words settled on everyone around. The neighbors, who had gathered, slowly and quietly began to nod in agreement, seeing the truth in her message. They realized how easy it could be to jump to conclusions, how quick fear could distort perception, and how a calm, thoughtful response could change the outcome entirely. Then, she did something that stunned the crowd. She introduced herself formally, stating her name and her position. A hush fell over the street as the words sank in. The woman who had called the police froze, her confidence shaken as she realized she had involved law enforcement without knowing the full story. The neighbors whispered among themselves, their curiosity now tinged with surprise and respect. The officers exchanged looks, realizing that the person they had been speaking with was not just the boy's mother, but the chief of police for the city. The revelation changed everything. The woman across the street, who had been tense and defensive, now felt a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She had believed she was acting cautiously and responsibly, but in an instant she understood that her assumptions had led to unnecessary involvement of law enforcement. She felt exposed, unsure of how to respond to someone of such authority who was also the mother of the child she had perceived as a threat. The boy, still holding on to his mother, looked up at her with curiosity and a bit of awe. He had known she was important and respected, but seeing the effect her words and presence had on the neighborhood and the officers was something new for him. He felt a sense of pride and safety, knowing that she could protect him not just as a parent but as someone with authority and experience. The officers, now fully aware of who they were speaking with, became even more careful to listen and observe, respecting both her authority and her calm approach to resolving the situation. The mother, sensing the tension and the lesson that needed to be taught, addressed the woman who had called the police directly but without anger or accusation. She explained that fear should never be based on appearances or assumptions. She spoke gently but firmly, making it clear that the boy was safe, innocent, and part of the community. The woman listened, speechless, as the weight of the words and the authority behind them sank in. There was no confrontation, only clarity and the undeniable presence of someone who combined wisdom with compassion. Neighbors continued to gather, intrigued, and moved by the unfolding moment. Some whispered quietly to one another about the power of calm authority. Others nodded in silent agreement. The boy's mother took the opportunity to teach not only her son, but the community as well. She spoke about respect, understanding, and the need to think before acting, emphasizing that children should always be allowed to play freely and safely. Her words were simple, direct, and resonated deeply with everyone present. The officers began to take a step back, acknowledging that the situation was under control and that the child's safety was ensured. They engaged in a quiet conversation with the mother, who offered guidance on how to handle similar situations in the future, demonstrating not only her authority, but also her willingness to educate. The boy listened closely, absorbing the calm yet powerful interaction, learning lessons about respect, authority, and community responsibility that he would remember for years to come. Meanwhile, the woman who had called the police remained standing at a distance, still unsure of how to process the moment. She felt the embarrassment of realizing she had misjudged the situation, but also a spark of understanding about how her assumptions had caused unnecessary tension. The mother's calm demeanor and authoritative presence created a space where reflection could happen without hostility, allowing the woman to recognize her mistake without confrontation. It was a quiet but powerful lesson, one that lingered in the minds of all who witnessed it. The boy, feeling the reassurance of his mother and sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to play again, slowly at first, testing the space around him. His laughter returned, softer at first but growing in strength as he realized that he was safe and protected. His mother remained nearby, guiding him with quiet gestures and subtle words, ensuring that he felt the freedom of childhood while also understanding the importance of awareness and safety. The officers observed, impressed by her approach, and the neighbors watched in quiet admiration, absorbing the lessons of empathy and thoughtful judgment. As the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the mother continued to speak to those around her about fairness, respect, and the dangers of assumptions. She emphasized the importance of seeing the humanity in others and not letting fear dictate actions. Her words were not just for the woman who had called the police, but for everyone present, including the boy, the officers, and the neighbors. It was a moment of teaching, reflection, and understanding that extended beyond the immediate incident. The woman who had called the police began to retreat back into her house, her mind racing with the realization of what had happened. She had acted out of fear, and now she understood the consequences of that fear. The mother's words and presence had transformed the moment into a lesson, not a confrontation. It was clear that this child's safety had been preserved, and that the neighborhood had witnessed the importance of calm, authority, and compassion. The boy continued to play, now with a sense of confidence restored, and his mother remained close, keeping a watchful eye while allowing him the freedom to enjoy the rest of his afternoon. The officers slowly drove away, satisfied that the situation had been handled appropriately and peacefully. The neighborhood, once tense and uncertain, had returned to a state of calm, with an added layer of understanding about the importance of careful judgment and human compassion. By the time the street began to quiet down, the boy had learned a subtle lesson about the power of presence, authority, and calmness in the face of fear. His mother, standing tall and composed, had turned a potentially tense situation into a teaching moment for her child and for the entire neighborhood. The sun continued to shine on the quiet street, the air filled with the restored sounds of laughter and play, and the subtle hum of community life continued, now enriched with a shared understanding of respect, safety, and humanity. The mother, still standing close to her son, took a deep breath and looked around at the small crowd that had gathered. The street was quiet now except for the soft sounds of the boys' bike tires rolling along the pavement and the faint hum of distant traffic. She knew that the most important part of this moment was not just calming her son, but helping everyone involved understand the importance of fairness, perspective, and humanity. Her calm authority created a sense of reassurance that radiated outward, touching the officers, the neighbors, and even the woman who had called the police. She began to speak again, this time addressing the crowd and the woman directly, explaining how children should always be allowed to enjoy their time outside without fear or judgment. She reminded them that fear and assumptions could cause unnecessary harm, and that it was crucial to see beyond appearances. Her voice was steady, her words simple and clear, yet they carried a weight that commanded attention. People listened, some nodding quietly, others whispering to one another, realizing the truth in her message. The woman who had called the police still stood nearby, unsure of how to respond. She felt a wave of embarrassment and guilt for having reacted hastily, but she also felt the undeniable impact of the mother's presence and words. There was no anger directed at her, only understanding and calm instruction. The mother's approach was not to shame but to teach, and that made the woman pause and reflect on her actions. She realized how her assumptions had created a ripple effect that could have been far worse, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility to do better. The boy, encouraged by his mother's calm demeanor, began to play again, though more cautiously at first. He pedaled slowly in small circles, glancing up at his mother for reassurance. She smiled at him gently, nodding, letting him know that he was safe. The officers watched quietly, taking in the scene, learning about the power of authority exercised with care and compassion. They observed how the mother balanced firmness with kindness, guiding her son while also educating the community. Neighbors who had been observing the situation began to relax as well. They saw that the child was safe. The officers were satisfied that there was no danger, and the woman who had called the police was quietly taking in the lesson being delivered. The mother spoke about the importance of being mindful of others, of not letting fear dictate actions, and of the responsibility each person has to create a safe and understanding community. Her words were simple but impactful, resonating with everyone who heard them. The woman who had called the police finally spoke, her voice hesitant and soft. She admitted that she had acted out of fear, and that she had not considered the boy's innocence or the context of the situation. She apologized quietly, her eyes downcast, and the mother nodded, acknowledging her words. There was no anger or confrontation, only a clear message that learning from mistakes and taking responsibility was what mattered most. The woman listened closely as the mother explained how assumptions could harm both children and the community, and how awareness and empathy could prevent unnecessary incidents. The boy's mother then turned her attention fully to him, kneeling down to his level and speaking gently. She reminded him that he had done nothing wrong, that he was safe, and that it was okay to be scared sometimes, but also important to trust those who loved and protected him. The boy nodded, feeling reassured, and hugged his mother briefly before resuming his play with growing confidence. His laughter returned light and fair, refilling the street once again. The mother remained nearby, keeping a watchful eye but allowing him the freedom to enjoy his time outside. It was a delicate balance between protection and independence, and she handled it with grace. The officers spoke briefly among themselves, recognizing the lessons they had witnessed. They had seen firsthand how calm authority, clear communication, and compassion could diffuse a potentially tense situation. They appreciated the mother's approach, noting how her presence and guidance had prevented any escalation and had provided a teaching moment for the community. They knew that this was a rare example of leadership and parenting that combined authority with humanity, and they took mental notes for the future. The neighbors continued to watch quietly, absorbing the wisdom being shared. Some whispered to one another about the importance of not letting fear cloud judgment, while others discussed the need for better understanding and awareness in their own interactions. The mother addressed them gently, encouraging dialogue and reflection, reminding them that a safe and caring community requires mindfulness, empathy, and responsibility from everyone. Her words were not harsh or critical, but they carried a weight that left a lasting impression. The woman who had called the police retreated back into her house, feeling a mix of humility and gratitude. She had learned a valuable lesson about the consequences of assumptions and the power of calm, informed authority. She realized that her actions had the potential to harm innocent lives, and that taking a moment to understand before reacting could prevent unnecessary tension and fear. She silently promised herself to be more aware and careful in the future. The boy continued to play, now fully confident that he was safe. His mother stayed close, offering guidance and reassurance as needed, but allowing him the freedom to enjoy the afternoon. She smiled as he pedaled around, his laughter ringing out in the warm sunlight, a reminder of the innocence and joy that childhood should hold. The officers eventually left, satisfied that the situation had been handled peacefully and that everyone involved had learned something valuable. As the afternoon continued, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. People resumed their activities, but there was a subtle change in the air. Conversations about understanding, empathy, and responsibility had begun, sparked by the mother's words and actions. The lesson extended beyond the immediate situation, influencing not just the woman who had called the police, but the entire community. It was a reminder that vigilance and care must always be balanced with fairness and compassion. The boy's mother reflected on the events as she watched him play. She knew that what had happened today could have been stressful, but she also recognized the opportunity it provided to teach important lessons about fairness, authority, and empathy. She had protected her child, educated her community, and reinforced the values she held dear. The boy, feeling safe and reassured, continued to explore, laugh, and play, experiencing the freedom of childhood without fear. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the mother and her son were finally able to take a deep breath. The neighborhood had witnessed a powerful example of calm authority and human-centered leadership. The officers had learned a lesson about assessment and perception. The neighbors had learned about the importance of empathy and awareness, and the woman who had called the police had learned the impact of assumptions. Most importantly, the boy had learned that he was safe, loved, and protected by someone who could guide him through any challenge. The quiet street, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Children's laughter could be heard again, and the neighborhood felt a renewed sense of community and understanding. The mother's presence and actions had not only resolved the situation, but had also created a moment of reflection, growth, and teaching for everyone involved. Her calm authority, compassion, and guidance had transformed a potentially tense encounter into a lasting lesson about humanity, safety, and the power of thoughtful action. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm golden light across the quiet neighborhood. The boy, now feeling confident and reassured, rode his bicycle along the familiar sidewalks, laughing as he passed houses he knew so well. His mother stayed nearby, walking beside him, her eyes soft but alert, making sure he remained safe while enjoying the freedom of the afternoon. The street was calm, the earlier tension now dissipated, replaced by a sense of reflection and understanding that lingered in the air. The woman who had called the police had retreated to her home, her thoughts heavy with realization. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, recognizing the fear and assumptions that had driven her actions. There was a deep sense of embarrassment, yes, but also a newfound awareness. She understood how easily perception could distort reality, and how her choices could affect innocent lives. Slowly, she opened her window and watched the boy and his mother from a distance, feeling a mixture of guilt and admiration for the calm authority with which the mother had handled the situation. Neighbors who had witnessed the events were now speaking quietly among themselves. The lesson was clear. Fear could cloud judgment, and calm, thoughtful action could prevent unnecessary harm. The mother's words and presence had reached them in a way that was gentle but undeniable. Conversations began about empathy, awareness, and responsibility, and for many it was a moment of introspection. Some admitted they had judged others unfairly in the past, while others promised to be more careful about acting on assumptions. The neighborhood had learned something valuable that day, not from lectures, but from a living example of leadership and compassion. The boy's mother knelt beside him as he paused his bicycle near a tree, picking up a small leaf and examining it with curiosity. She spoke softly, reminding him of the lessons they had both learned through the incident. She explained that while most days were filled with play and joy, there would sometimes be moments when people might misunderstand or misjudge him. She told him that in such moments, staying calm, Trusting in his own innocence and knowing he had protection and love around him were the best ways to navigate the world. The boy listened attentively, absorbing every word with wide-eyed understanding. As the sun dipped lower, the mother guided her son back toward their home. Their pace was slow, not rushed, giving him time to reflect on what had happened while still feeling the freedom and safety of the afternoon. He began to ask questions not out of fear, but out of curiosity about why the neighbor had reacted the way she did, why the police had arrived, and why people sometimes made quick judgments. The mother answered each question honestly, using simple language that a child could understand. She emphasized the importance of fairness, seeing the good in others, and never letting fear dictate decisions. The officers who had been involved in the incident made one final pass down the street, nodding politely to the mother and child as they drove by. They had witnessed something profound, a parent managing a tense and potentially volatile situation with a mixture of calm authority and empathy, teaching both child and community valuable lessons in the process. They reflected on the importance of context, communication, and awareness, knowing that their own experiences that day would influence their approach in the future. The neighborhood, now bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun, seemed transformed. The earlier tension had given way to understanding and contemplation. The woman who had called the police watched quietly, internalizing the lesson she had been shown. She realized that her actions, while not malicious, had stemmed from fear and bias, and that awareness and humility were necessary to prevent such mistakes in the future. Her perspective had shifted, not through confrontation or anger, but through the quiet, composed authority of the mother. The boy, feeling secure and encouraged, began to explore a little more boldly again. He rode his bicycle in larger circles, stopping occasionally to wave at familiar neighbors, who now smiled back warmly, a subtle acknowledgement of the lessons learned and the restoration of trust. His laughter, light and carefree, filled the air once more, a reminder that childhood should be free from fear and worry. The mother followed closely, her calm presence reinforcing that he was safe, loved, and understood. As they walked back toward their home, the mother took a moment to speak to the neighbors gathered nearby. She thanked them for their attention and consideration, gently reminding them that everyone had a role in creating a safe, understanding, and respectful community. Her words were simple, clear, and heartfelt, leaving a lasting impression on those who heard them. People nodded quietly, reflecting on their own actions and commitments to their neighbors, realizing that small moments of awareness and empathy could make a significant difference. Inside the house, the mother guided her son to wash his hands and have a snack, helping him transition from the tense afternoon to a sense of normalcy and comfort. She talked with him about what had happened, reinforcing the lessons in fairness, understanding, and trust. The boy listened carefully, his eyes wide with comprehension, feeling the support and guidance of a parent who not only protected him physically, but also nurtured his understanding of the world. Later, as the